We're always told that where you live, your zip code, can predict almost everything about your health. But what about something as specific as surgery? I mean, once you're actually on the operating table, does your address really matter for how well you recover? Well, the answer is not at all what you'd expect. Okay, first, let's talk about the condition at the center of all this. And wow, it's a mouthful. Insertional Achilles Tendinopathy with Haglund's deformity. Let's just break that down. Basically, it's a super painful, long-term heel problem that comes from repetitive stress. It can even cause this bony lump to form on your heel. The best way to think about it? Imagine walking around all day, every day, with a sharp pebble permanently stuck in your shoe. That is what these patients are dealing with.
So for a lot of these folks, when other treatments don't work, surgery becomes the only real option. But that opens up a huge question, right? Once someone has the surgery, what actually determines if it's a success? What are the key ingredients for a good recovery? And this gets us right to the heart of the study we're digging into. Researchers wanted to see if a factor that's maybe less obvious, your socioeconomic status, which they measured using a zip code, could actually predict how you do after the surgery. It seems like a pretty common sense question to ask.
We're all familiar with the usual suspects. Doctors have known forever that things like a high BMI, having diabetes, or being a smoker can make surgery and recovery way more complicated. But these researchers wanted to look past the purely physical stuff. What about the world a patient returns to after they leave the hospital?
And here it is, right from the source. The whole point of their study was to figure out the impact of what they call socioeconomic distress, which is really just a way of measuring the financial hardship in a patient's community on the recovery from this very specific surgery.
So their starting point, their hypothesis, seemed completely logical. They figured that patients coming from more distressed, lower-income areas would have a much harder recovery. Worse outcomes, more complications, just a tougher road back to health. It makes total sense. Or does it?
All right, so you've got this big question. How in the world do you even start to test it? Well, the researchers laid out a really clear step-by-step plan to get to the bottom of it.
Their whole process was really a three-parter. First, they gathered their patient group, 171 people who'd all had this exact heel surgery. Second, they looked at where these patients lived. They took every zip code and matched it to something called the Distress Communities Index, which basically ranks neighborhoods from prosperous all the way down to distressed. And last, they had to measure success. They tracked every patient's recovery using a standardized scoring system for foot and ankle function.
And what's really cool is that their patient group was pretty much perfect for this kind of question. As you can see here, they had a really solid mix of people from all across the economic map. A good number from prosperous areas, comfortable areas, and of course from those at-risk or distressed communities. This gave them a fantastic baseline to make a fair comparison.
Okay, so the stage is set. They've got the patients, they've got the data, they've tracked the recovery. So, was their common sense hypothesis right? Time for the big reveal. And this is where the story just flips completely upside down. On the left, you've got what everybody thought would happen. Patients from distressed areas would have slower recoveries, more complications, the whole deal. But on the right, that's what actually happened. Recovery times, complication rates, even the need for more surgeries. It was all basically the same, no matter what community you came from. The hypothesis was totally wrong. And this chart just says it all, doesn't it? This shows how much better patients were doing 1 year after their surgery. Just look at those bars. They're almost identical. It didn't matter if a patient lived in a wealthy suburb or an inner-city neighborhood, their ability to get back to their life improved by pretty much the exact same amount. 0. That's the magic number here. That's how many significant differences they found between the groups. Not in tendon retears, not in hospital readmissions, not in how long it took to get back on their feet, nothing. When it came down to it, a patient's zip code had 0 predictive power. And if you thought that was surprising, get this. Here's the final twist in the story. Not only did patients from distressed communities not have worse outcomes, the data actually showed a tiny little trend. And I should say it wasn't statistically significant, but a trend suggesting they might have had even better improvement than the other groups. The complete opposite of what everyone expected. So what in the world are we supposed to make of all this? A perfectly logical, common-sense idea was just completely blown out of the water. Let's try to unpack what this incredible finding really means. Okay, so the first huge takeaway is that at least for this specific surgery within a big, well-funded hospital system, where you live just didn't predict how you do. This might mean that things we can't easily measure, like a patient's own personal resilience or their motivation, might be way more important than their community's economics. Now, we've got to be fair here and mention the limitations. This was just one study at one hospital, and it used zip codes, which is a broad measure, not a person's individual income. The results might look very different somewhere else with fewer resources.
And all of this leaves us with one last, really big question to chew on. This study took a core belief we have about healthcare and challenged it. It really makes you wonder, if the link between your zip code and your surgical recovery isn't what we thought, what other common sense ideas in medicine might be overdue for a second look? Definitely something to think about.